Yesterday. Is there anybody here today who wasn't here yesterday? Yeah, okay, cool. So just a bit of background again in case you've forgotten, because you've had a cast of thousands. My name's Dea Morgain and I work with the Gamblers Help Team, and our role is to support the relationship with funded agencies. And I work in a team with Grace and Rachel, Rebecca and Louise and Andrina. So you'll get to meet us all over time. So I've been asked today to come in and talk to you about the client outcome survey, which I mentioned yesterday in passing. Has anybody seen the client outcome survey? Anybody not seen it? Okay, so I've got a few copies here, and just so you've got a bit of background. So it's administered to all clients in therapeutic and financial counselling, so not venue support or ComEd. And it's our primary measure about the efficacy of our service, like is what we're doing across Victoria actually making a difference in people's lives. And it's our primary measure to the Victorian Government about the value of the services that we deliver. So it's critically important to know that we're doing, as a whole, across the state service, that we're doing a good job, and to be able to provide evidence of that. It also, for agencies, helps to identify good practice, so that when you have a look at it, and we'll go through it in more detail, knowing that you're getting good results and these scores would tell you that what you're doing makes a difference. And equally, if you put in place a different way of working and the scores dropped or went up, that will give you some information about how effective your service was. And for some agencies, they use it as a tool within the sort of therapeutic and financial counselling model. So what is the COS? It's made up of the Kessler K6, which is a 6-question validated tool, and it measures psychological distress. Do people know Kessler? Do people who are not therapeutic counsellors know Kessler? So Kessler is the sort of major tool used in Australia to measure psychological distress. So the Australian Bureau of Stats uses it, general practice use it, it's used across the board, and there's different variations of it. So the most common in Australia are the K6 and K10, and the 6 and 10 just refer to how many questions there are. So in the K6 there's only 6 questions, and they are pretty basic for people to answer about whether they feel, looking back over the last 30 days, if you felt so sad that nothing could cheer you up, nervous, restless or fidgety, hopeless, that everything was an effort or worthless. And if you get high scores in those areas, it would indicate that you were experiencing quite a high level of psychological distress. Whereas if your scores are lower, it would say that your level of psychological distress is not that great. So it's been validated across the world. That is, that they've used it with lots and lots of populations and then tested those groups with other ways of testing and found that these are good measures of psychological distress. It's been tested with many different cultural groups around the world and found to be usable with other cultural groups and to still measure the right things. So that's the first part of the COS, is the K6. Then there's 3 fairly basic questions about gambling. So whether in the last 4 weeks you're gambling or your other person, your loved one's gambling has affected your relationships with people in your life, made your financial situation worse, or affected your ability to work or be productive at work. So they're kind of pretty basic measures about how you're going. The interesting things is that, for me, is that in the early data that we're seeing from COS, from all the agencies, is that in the Kessler, people are making quite a significant improvement through their engagement with Gamblers Help Service. So most people come in with mild to moderate psychological distress, such that it would be equivalent to experiencing anxiety or depression. And that's the sort of average across the state. But what we're seeing is that through the contact with you folk, that's dropping to being a pretty average level of functioning in the world. So we are seeing quite a big improvement in Kessler scores. With the questions about relationships, financial situation and ability to work, the improvements are more modest, and I think that would probably be accurate, that it is those things take longer to change, that what changes first is how you're feeling internally, and what changes second is how things are functioning in the world. So we are seeing improvement in these areas, but it's not such a dramatic change. And it will be interesting, COS is done at 3 points in time. So the first time it's administered is by you folks in your services, before the first session or at the first session. And why that's so critical that it's before or at the first session is because it gives baseline data. Has anybody heard the phrase baseline data before? You want to have a go at trying to explain it? You'll probably do better than me. No? So baseline data is really, if you're measuring anything, you need to know where you're coming from. And so it's the base, it's like where you start from. And with measuring outcomes for clients, if we don't measure it before they have contact with a therapeutic counsellor, then we've missed that baseline. And so, in fact, we're not measuring the right thing. If they've already had a session with you or 2 sessions with you, they will have improved. So we're not getting them at the first point. So that's why it's really important. Some agencies are administering this as a form in the waiting room. So when a client turns up, the reception or intake worker gives them a number of forms, and this is one of them. And if not, then at the very beginning of measuring a change over time, because they already will have improved by the time it's completed. So it's completed by you in that first session or before the first session, and then it goes to Turning Point through GH Connect, and they, with the permission of the client, they make contact 12 weeks later, and that's where we get to see the change. So even if they only ever had 1 session with your service, that might be enough. That might be all of that they needed to get their kind of thinking about gambling straight, or they might have had 12 sessions with you. Either way, we're measuring what's happened in that 12-week period. So the second survey is administered by telephone from Turning Point, and you collect information about how people want to be contacted. So all that's dealt with. The difference in the second survey is that it also includes the satisfaction questions about your service. And so it's basic things about Gamblers Help, whether you saw the person quickly, whether it was easy to get to you, whether you were open when the person needed you, whether you saw them as often as they needed, and whether you told them about the other Gamblers Help services so that they could ring the telephone or they could use the internet stuff. And then there's an overall measure of satisfaction with the service and whether they'd recommend the service to someone else, which is often a good measure of how confident. Hello, come in, grab a seat. It's fine. And it also asks if they want to be referred back to a Gamblers Help service. So you can imagine if they saw you 2 or 3 times and then 8 weeks later somebody rings them to do this survey, things might have changed for them and they actually might want to come back into the service, so Turning Point will address that as well. There is then a third COS which is done another 12 weeks later, and again by phone. It doesn't have the service satisfaction, it just goes back to the basic questions about the Kessler and gambling. Within COS, there's another set of questions that we only ask people who are affected by their own gambling, so we don't ask affected others, so friends and family. And that's about how much time they spent gambling, how many times they gambled, and whether their losses have, what their losses are, and then whether that's increased or decreased. But also critically, how much time they've spent thinking about gambling in the previous fortnight and whether that's increased or decreased, because again the evidence suggests that's a very good measure of how well somebody is recovering from a gambling-related problem. Do you have any questions at this stage about the cause? Does it make sense to people why it's so important to us to do it? I'm going to come up, there's a fan between.
Do we have to send us a template?
A template, yeah. Do you work with one of the in-language services?
Yes.
So Grace is currently developing a new, I should have said that, thank you for the reminder. This one's only used in the mainstream Gamblers Help Services. It's not used in the in-language services or the Aboriginal services. Because we know that the Kessler, which is the first bit, has been validated with a range of communities, but it hasn't been validated with the Aboriginal community, so we don't know if answering these questions is a measure of psychological distress for Aboriginal people. So that for both the in-language and the Aboriginal services, we're in the process of developing client outcome surveys that we know to be effective in those communities.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
The K10, you can actually, just as a comment, you can actually find it on the New South Wales website that's translated into other languages. But I've just, in my experience, working with a variety of communities in my other roles, I've found that the K10 and the questions, even in translated form, are very hard for clients to answer. There are terms that just they do not get, that don't translate.
There is a,
things like
yeah,
restlessness and
yeah,
hopeless and things like that, where I have to really sometimes even spend a session
talking them
just
through.
giving that prior
Yeah,
information as to what that means and how that might feel like, and so they got that I guess knowledge to then answer the question.
yeah, absolutely. And that is the reason why we're looking at different client outcome tools for the in-language services and the Aboriginal services. But that being said, if you have, obviously if somebody within the Gamblers Help Services, there's people from all sorts of different cultural backgrounds accessing our services. And Kessler is probably the better. I totally take your point that for some people it's very difficult to understand.
Talk about it a lot more,
Yeah.
opposed to just giving it to them and asking them to feel it.
Yeah.
Like you would do in a waiting area and a more mainstream service. Is it better if you're working cross-culturally to have them with you in the room and possibly go through it together, and it could take you the whole session.
Yeah, yeah. And which is not a bad way to spend a session.
Yes.
In that one of the things that Kessler's used for, I have a background counselling as well, and one of the things that Kessler is used for is as a tool within therapeutic counselling to help somebody to identify for themselves where they're at, but also to map their own progress. Kessler can actually be used by a client as a tool to measure their own level of well-being. And it's, I don't know about Kessler 6 actually, but Kessler 10 is readily available on the internet, and GPs hand it out when they do the mental health plan.
Costs a lot with the mental health, GPs mental health,
Yeah.
and also for postnatal depression for mothers.
Yeah.
As in service, I just have to sit there and explain to them. Very take a long time because
Yeah.
some, like you said, some person is not.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to
Yeah.
understand.
And that also happens with people who've got low literacy levels, even if English is their first language. Being presented with this form can just be totally off-putting for people, and we'd much rather that you spent the time with them talking it through than it was just rejected because it is a written form. So there's lots of different ways people use this, but I would particularly therapeutic counsellors, I'm just about to cough, excuse me. There are ways of using it within a therapeutic relationship.
Good question as well. With the second and third follow-up, what sort of rate of take-up are you finding
Yeah.
people opting in to do the follow-ups?
Yeah, so that was a question about the take-up of COS in COS 2 and COS 3, it's actually better than you might expect. So that people are generally agreeable if a counsellor explains to them why we're contacting them again in 12 weeks. If people don't explain it, it can be really intimidating, like why the hell would you want to ring me in 12 weeks and why would this serve? People are kind of put off. But when it's explained to people both as a therapeutic tool, that we want to know that you are getting better, but also that idea of it measuring how good we are as a service, and that it does matter to all of us that we actually are providing a good quality service to the community. It is surprising that people do agree. We give them quite a few choices about how to be contacted, and getting that right's important. That being said, there are people, of course, who go, yeah, not so comfortable with that, don't want to go down that track, and that's okay. There are also people who say yes, but then when Turning Point contacts them, they're like, no, changed my mind. And occasionally we get people who go, I'll do it, but only if it's you. And so there is a way in the system to build that in. So if you've got a client who's like, I'm happy to fill this in 12 weeks, but I don't want a phone service ringing me, then there is a way to do that, so it's actually you that completes it a second time rather than it going out to Turning Point. Third one, I don't know the data, but I would put money on that we have a much lower take-up for COS 3 than COS 2, because that's pretty normal in any of these sort of survey instruments. Any other questions before we move on? No? All good? I don't know if I've got much else to tell you, I just want to check. Yeah, so in terms of responsibilities, the way that COS works on GH Connect is either the TC or the FC fills it in, not both. So if you've got a client who's seeing both a therapeutic and a financial counsellor, you'll see that on the GH Connect record. Most agencies decide that the therapeutic counsellor is responsible for COS when there's two. But it's up to your agency to work out how that works. But we only do one per client. So if you go to open a record on GH Connect and you see they're also seeing a financial counsellor, just make sure that you've worked out who's doing COS. The KPI for COS for your agency is 75%. And so it's quite a high KPI, and we spend quite a bit of time talking to managers about how important it is that we get back the COSs. This is how we report to state government for the whole state. So without the COSs being completed, all of our work is compromised. The client has to agree to participate, and that again comes down to the therapeutic relationship of making sure most people are willing to fill it in the kind of waiting room as a preliminary. It's because it is quite simple and it sort of on face value makes sense why you'd fill it in. If you have somebody who is reluctant, we do encourage you to talk it through with them, as people have been saying they do, rather than just accept that, because it's important people understand what's involved in order to either give consent or to refuse. And the COS data goes into GH Connect. It's a form on the GH Connect system. So if you have any trouble with that or you go to do it, just give the GH Connect helpline, which is here, a call, and they'll talk you through how to do that. Any other questions about COS?
Is there a, just because I'm aware, especially with comorbid
Yep.
conditions and people with, obviously they're not, most likely not coming in with one
Yeah.
issue, there could be trauma in the background, there could be anxiety, depression, family
Yeah.
violence. Does this take that into effect? So when you've done a first assessment or a next one, but there could be external factors affecting your results.
Yeah.
Is there a capacity to highlight that?
No, and that for good reasons. That when you're doing a survey across a whole program, so 5,000 clients plus a year, these surveys work best if you keep them to their absolute minimum. And so you could do a much bigger survey that took all of those factors into account, but we would get much lower participation rates if we did that. But how we do take that into account is within your own services. You'll see on GH Connect, there's many options for listing those co-occurring services. And we don't actually use the results as a KPI. So it's completion is the KPI, so it's that you've filled it in is a performance indicator for your agency, not your results. So we don't actually get down to agency level in terms of being able to judge the difference between the performance of agencies based on this. It is held at a statewide level, but you can do that at your agency level if you want to. So you can to look at your own results, but we don't at a statewide level. That makes sense? Yeah. Any other questions?
Do you want to just talk about the handout with the guys?
Oh yeah, forgot. Do you have a copy?
Sorry, thanks.
Yeah, it was a very good point. With the Kessler 6, there is a range of results, and Jodie's circulated a paper that addresses that. One of the things is that what we see is that most people are coming in, the average is about 16 points. So I'm looking at page 2, and there's something, thank you for lending us yours, that says Kessler 6 scoring algorithm. And basically it's saying the subclinical range is 6 to 18 points. So what that means is somebody fills in this on the front, and if you add up their points, they're getting between 6 and 18 points, and that's considered to be subclinical. In fact, what we know is I think between 11 and 16 is indicative of psychological distress, equivalent to anxiety or depression. And the average for the state seems to be around 16. But if you had a client who bumped up into this top score of 19 to 30, so that would indicate they were experiencing quite high levels of psychological distress, and that might be equivalent to having a serious mental illness. Now, it's really important, this is not a diagnostic tool. Because somebody gets, 30, it doesn't mean that they do have a mental illness. They might have experienced extreme trauma on the way in. There's all sorts of factors that play into that. But as a clinician, if you've got somebody up there in the 19 to 30 range, it's a good trigger for you to think about whether you do need to refer them to a mental health service to have an assessment around their mental health at that point, or also just talking within your own team with your supervisor about how that may impact on how you work with the client. So it's a good warning for you as the therapist to think.
What's that acronym on the third page?
Don't know.
The work.
Oh yeah, so there's the scale, I think it's called WASA or something, isn't it?
The Dodge, is that Department of Justice? Yes.
Yeah, and we have 3 questions, the one about relationships, financial situation and ability to work, that are drawn from the work and social adjustment scale, but we don't use the scale in its entirety. And that's partly because the feedback from Gamblers Help about 2 years ago was that the COS needed to be really shortened for people to be willing to do it. So we brought it back down to its most basic form. All right, is that everything? Any questions? All right, excellent. Nice to chat to you all again, and enjoy the rest of your afternoons.